Pope Leo XIV caught the security guard's wrist before he could pull the old woman away from the silver Packard. The guard froze. So did Bishop Adrian Bellamy, standing beneath the lights of a private hall surrounded by 39 classic cars worth nearly $12 million. The old woman held a brass ignition key between both hands. A small wooden tag hung from it, worn smooth by decades. 3 words had been burned into the wood. "For Sunday rides, Your Holiness," Bishop Bellamy said, lowering his voice. "The collectors will arrive in 23 minutes. Pope Leo did not look at him. He looked at the woman. She was perhaps 82. Her blue coat had been carefully brushed, but one cuff had been repaired with thread that did not match. A paper bus transfer stuck out of her pocket. She had folded it into a narrow strip so many times that it had begun to tear. "What is your name?" the Pope asked. "Margaret Hayes." "And why were you touching this car, Mrs. Hayes?" Margaret glanced at the bishop before answering. "My husband gave it to the church." Bishop Bellamy stepped forward. "The vehicle was donated to the deceased many years ago. It is now part of the St. Anselm Heritage Collection." Mrs. Hayes entered through a restricted door. Margaret lowered the key. "I only wanted to see whether it still fit." The Pope took the brass key from her palm. Then he looked past the Packard. There were polished Cadillacs, 2 Rolls-Royces, a red Italian sports car, a black Mercedes from the 1930s, and a row of convertibles shining beneath museum lamps. Velvet ropes separated them from the marble floor. Beside each car stood a card with its estimated value. The cheapest was worth more than Margaret's house. On the far wall, a gold sign announced that the collection would be transferred at noon to a newly created Diocese and Heritage Foundation. The Pope checked the clock. It was 11:38. "What happens at noon?" he asked. Bishop Bellamy answered carefully. "A legal transfer. It will protect the collection from future budget pressures and preserve it for generations." "Protect it from what?" "From being broken apart for temporary needs." Margaret's fingers closed around the torn bus transfer in her pocket. Pope Leo noticed. He asked her how. She had reached the hall. "2 buses," she said. "Then I walked from the highway." "Why did no parish driver bring you?" No one answered. The Pope turned toward the bishop. Bellamy's expression did not change, but his right thumb rubbed the edge of his episcopal ring. "The senior transportation ministry was discontinued last winter," he said. "It was no longer financially sustainable." Margaret tried to defend him. "I did not come to make trouble." Pope Leo gave the brass key back to her. "That may be true," he said, "but trouble was already here." He stepped beneath the velvet rope and placed his hand on the Packard's hood. The engine was cold. The wax was fresh. "Lock every exit," he told the guard. "No automobile leaves this hall." Bishop Bellamy stared at him. The collectors were now 20 minutes away. The legal papers were already waiting. And Pope Leo XIV had just seized control of a collection the bishop believed no one could touch. Bishop Adrian Bellamy had built his reputation on order. He had inherited debt, repaired buildings, balanced budgets, and won back wealthy donors. He arrived early, remembered every number, and never raised his voice. "The church cannot serve anyone if it cannot protect its assets," he often said. That sentence had become his shield. Inside a small office beside the motor hall, Bellamy opened 3 binders for Pope Leo. The collection, he explained, had begun with donated vehicles. Some had been restored using unrestricted gifts. Others had been purchased at favorable prices and increased in value. "It is not my private collection," he said. "I hold it for the fasces. Do you drive them only when maintenance requires it? Do the poor." Bellamy paused. "These are historic machines, Holy Father. They are not suitable for ordinary transportation." The Pope opened the first binder. The paperwork was clean. Each car belonged to a diocesan entity. Each restoration had been approved by a committee. Each expense had a signature. There was no envelope of stolen cash. No secret garage under a mansion. Nothing that looked like a simple crime. That made the truth harder. Bishop Bellamy had not hidden the cars. He had taught everyone around him to call them ministry. A financial officer entered with the transfer documents. Once signed at noon, the collection would pass to a separate board chaired by Bellamy. Pope Leo looked at the clock. 11:44. He turned to the final page of the senior transportation budget. The St. Christopher Ride Ministry had served 7 parishes. Its annual cost had been $186,000. Bellamy had closed it as unsustainable. In the same year, the deceased had spent $1,800,000 restoring 3 automobiles. The bishop did not deny the numbers. The restoration money was restricted by donors. Pope Leo tapped the page. And the money that maintained the senior vans, general operating funds. So one kind of money was protected. Yes. And the people were not. Bellamy's jaw tightened. That is not a fair description. Margaret sat outside the office, watching the key in her hand. Pope Leo opened the restoration file for the Packard. Under the newer invoices, he found an old maintenance card stained with grease. The handwriting had faded, but the title remained clear. St. Christopher's Sunday Car. Below it were 14 names and pickup times. Mrs. Doyle, 7:10. Mr. and Mrs. Green, 7:25. Miss Alvarez, wheelchair, 7:40. The last name was Margaret Hayes. The Pope carried the card outside. You rode in this car? Margaret nodded. My husband Thomas repaired it after the original owner gave it to our parish. Father Bellamy drove it on Sundays before he became a bishop. For the first time, Bellamy looked directly at her. Margaret continued. Thomas said the car should belong to anyone, too old to reach Mass alone. When he became sick, we signed it over to the diocese so the rides would continue. Bellamy took one step toward her. That was more than 30 years ago. The car had become unsafe. Then why did you spend $400,000 making it beautiful again? The Pope asked. The bishop's thumb stopped moving against his ring. Outside, engines approached the front gate. The first collectors had arrived early. The foundation attorney was already waiting. Pope Leo returned to the Packard and opened the driver's door. The leather smelled new. The dashboard had been rebuilt. The wooden tag in Margaret's hand was the only thing in the hall that still carried the original purpose. Then the Pope lowered the sun visor. A photograph fell onto the seat. It showed a young father, Adrian Bellamy, behind the wheel of the same Packard. Thomas Hayes stood beside him in work clog. 3 elderly women smiled from the back seat. Across the bottom, someone had written a promise. No one stays home on Sunday. Bishop Bellamy saw the photograph, and for the first time, that morning he had no clean explanation. The collectors were held in the reception hall. Bellamy believed the Pope needed time to calm down. He did not understand that Pope Leo was now following the people erased by the collection. Margaret led him to a narrow garage behind St. Matthew Parish 4 miles away. The last St. Christopher van stood inside with a dead battery and 1 flat tire. Dust covered the windshield. A rosary still hung from the mirror. A paper route sheet remained clipped above the steering wheel. 28 names. Beside 11 of them, someone had written homebound. Margaret touched the passenger door but did not open it. I kept thinking they would start again in the spring, she said. Deacon Luis Ortega had managed the ride ministry for 12 years. He was 71 and walked with a stiff left leg. After the program closed, he had continued taking 3 people to medical appointments in his own pickup truck. He showed Pope Leo a box of returned keys. Each key belonged to a parish van. When the budget was cut, 7 parishes lost transportation in 1 week. Bellamy called it consolidation. The people on the route sheet called it staying home. Margaret had missed 11 Sundays. Still, every Saturday evening she polished the black shoes she used to wear to Mass and placed them beside the door. I did not want them to think I had given up, she said. Pope Leo looked at the rosary hanging from the dead van. Who approved the closure? Deacon Lewis handed him a copy of the final order. Bishop Adrian Bellamy's signature stood at the bottom. But there was another page. 3 months before closing the vans, the deceased had transferred $600,000 from a reserve created by elderly parishioners. The money had not gone directly into the car collection. It had been described as a temporary internal loan, then moved through the general fund before paying restoration bills. The procedure fits the diocese's internal rules. Its purpose did not. Bellamy had protected an appreciating asset because no spreadsheet showed Margaret's empty Sunday shoes. Pope Leo returned to the motor hall before noon. The bishop stood alone beside the Packard. The old photograph was in his hand. "I remember that morning," Bellamy said. "Thomas had repaired the fuel pump with almost nothing. I drove 12 people to Mass. What did you believe then? That the church should reach those who could not reach it? What changed?" Bellamy looked toward the cars. Responsibility changed. A parish priest music can solve one problem. A bishop has to preserve an institution. Pope Leo picked up Margaret's brass key. When did preserving the institution require breaking its promise? Bellamy did not answer. He spoke about donor confidence and long-term value. His words sounded sensible. That was why they had survived so long. Then Margaret entered the hall. She carried the torn bus transfer and the wooden tag. Bellamy moved toward her. "I never intended for you to be harmed." Margaret looked at the Packard. "I know." The bishop seemed relieved. Then she added, "But people are still waiting." If this story brings to mind someone whose years of quiet service were forgotten, write their name in the comments and let that name be seen. Pope Leo placed the old photograph on the Packard's windshield. He ordered the foundation documents removed from the signing room. He ordered the front doors opened. He ordered the velvet ropes taken down. Then he gave Deacon Louise one instruction. Bring every person whose name is still on that route sheet. The clock above the hall changed to 11:57. The transfer was 3 minutes away. The bishop reached for the papers. Pope Leo covered them with his hand. "No one signs," he said. Outside, the collectors had begun to gather. Inside, the first senior van in months was being started with jumper cables. At noon, the gold sign on the wall still announced the transfer of the St. Anselm Heritage Collection, but the table beneath it, music, was empty. The contracts were gone. Attorneys and wealthy collectors stood beside the cars. A local choir waited with unopened music folders. Then the side doors opened. Deacon Luis drove the dead van into the hall. Its engine shook. Its paint had faded. It was worth less than one set of tires on the red sports car beside it. Margaret sat in the front passenger seat. Behind her were 6 elderly parishioners, 2 used walkers. One man held an oxygen cylinder between his knees. A 90-year-old woman named Ruth carried a missal wrapped in a kitchen towel so the cover would not tear. 3 more cars arrived with people from the route sheet. Pope Leo walked to the center of the hall. He did not ask the collectors to leave. He wanted witnesses. Bishop Bellamy stood beside the Packard in formal black, composed again. He had spent his life learning how to remain calm while others became emotional. Pope Leo held up the wooden key tag. "For Sunday rides," he read. Then he asked one question. "Who is this collection protecting?" Bellamy answered with the sentence he trusted most. "The church cannot serve anyone if it cannot protect its assets." Pope Leo nodded. Then he pointed to the old van. "Is that not an asset?" The bishop looked at it. It was no longer efficient. Pope Leo pointed to Margaret. "Is she?" Bellamy's face changed. "That is not what I meant." "No. The Pope said it is what your decisions meant." He placed the old photograph on a display stand beside the Packard. The collectors leaned closer. They saw the young priest behind the wheel. They saw Thomas Hayes. They saw the elderly women in the back seat. Then Pope Leo read the promise written beneath them. "No one stays home on Sunday." Bellamy closed his eyes for 1 second. The Pope did not call him a thief. He made the bishop explain the numbers before the people who had paid the cost. $186,000 to keep the senior transportation ministry running for a year. $118,000 to restore 3 cars. 7 parish routes closed. 39 classic cars protected. Bellamy tried once more. The restoration funds attracted donors who would never have supported ordinary transportation. A collector near the front lowered his catalog. Pope Leo turned toward him. Would you have refused to help them? The man looked at Margaret, then at the oxygen cylinder in the van. No, Holy Father. A woman who had planned to bid on the Mercedes asked how much a wheelchair van cost. Then Margaret stepped beside the Packard. She placed the brass key on its hood. I did not come to take this back, she said. I came because my husband gave it away for a reason. Her voice was small. No microphone was needed. Bishop Bellamy stared at the key. Margaret looked at him with more sorrow than anger. You drove us once, Father. The old title struck him harder than the new one, Father. Not chairman, not administrator. The young priest in the photograph had once waited outside small houses, carried walkers, and known every name on the route. The bishop reached toward the Packard, but his hand stopped before touching it. Pope Leo spoke quietly. Mrs. Hayes does not need an apology that protects your dignity. She needs the promise restored. Then he announced his decision. The collection would be placed under immediate independent stewardship. The noon transfer was canceled. Bishop Bellamy would step away from all financial authority while the internal fund transfers were reviewed. 38 vehicles would be sold through a public charitable auction. Not $1 would return to the prestige budget. The proceeds would create Mercy Roads, a permanent transportation and mobile health ministry for elderly, disabled, and homebound parishioners across the diocese. The first funds would purchase 12 wheelchair-accessible vans and equip 3 mobile clinics for rural communities. A protected maintenance reserve would keep them operating after the attention faded. Then Pope Leo revealed what would happen to the 39th car. The Packard would not be sold or kept beneath museum lights. It would carry elderly parishioners to Mass each Sunday and visit the homebound during the week. Retired mechanics would maintain it and the wooden tag would remain on the key. Bishop Bellamy looked at the Pope. Who will drive it? Pope Leo handed him the route sheet. You will. Begin. A murmur moved through the hall. This is not humiliation. The Pope said humiliation is making an old woman cross 2 bus lines to ask why the church forgot her. Service is how truth becomes repentance. Bellamy read the first name, Ruth Donnelly. The 90-year-old woman with the wrapped missal lifted her hand as though she were back in school. The bishop walked to her. He did not offer a speech. He took her walker and placed it carefully in the Packard's trunk. Then he opened the rear door. The collectors watched him help her inside. Margaret still stood beside the door. Bellamy turned to her last. I remembered the value of the car, he said. I forgot the value of the trip. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then drive slowly, she said. Ruth gets frightened on turns. The choir abandoned its planned program and sang an old hymn Margaret knew by heart. Pope Leo removed the gold transfer sign. Deacon Lewis replaced it with the dusty route sheet. Each car received a new card explaining what its sale would fund. The red sports car, valued at more than $2 million, received the shortest. This car will bring the forgotten home. Before the Packard left the hall, Pope Leo placed Margaret in the front passenger seat. Bishop Bellamy sat behind the wheel. His hands rested at 10 and 2, the way Thomas Hayes had taught him 30 years earlier. The great doors opened. The Packard rolled into daylight carrying Margaret Ruth and 2 widowers who had not attended Mass since the van stopped. The old parish van followed. The bishop had gathered 39 cars to preserve an institution. The Pope had turned them into roads back to people. 6 months later, the motor hall no longer smelled of wax. It smelled of coffee, rubber, and warm engines. Mercy Roads vans stood where the Rolls-Royces had been displayed. Retired mechanics worked beside young apprentices. Only the silver Packard remained. Its paint still shone, but a folded walker now rested in the trunk. On Sunday morning, Bishop Bellamy stopped outside Margaret Hayes's house. He was serving under supervision and no longer controlled a budget. He wore a plain black coat and carried the route sheet in his breast pocket. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. Her polished Sunday shoes were already on her feet. At the next house, they collected Ruth and her missile. At the last stop, a 93-year-old widow stood behind the screen door, afraid the car had come to the wrong address. Margaret lowered the window. "We have been waiting for you," she said. The woman climbed in slowly. Before the Packard moved, she noticed the wooden tag hanging from the brass key for Sunday rides. She touched the words with one finger. Then the old carried 4 people toward the church they had once believed they would never enter again. And on that morning, its greatest value was not what a collector would pay for it. Its greatest value was that no one stayed.